Hello everyone, my name is Asa. Will be doing a live, most certainly uncut reading of Edgar Allan Poe's complete stories and poems. I'll leave the edition of the book in the description of all of my videos. For this first one, and really as a test of the audio as well as my speaking and just seeing how it all works out, I decided to read the biographical note about Edgar Allan Poe. Let's see if it says who it was written by. It doesn't say, but it might be the editors or something of this book. But regardless, I'll be starting with the biographical note in this first video, and then following that, I think I will basically be progressing in order of the stories. This edition has all the stories first and then all of the poems. For the stories, I will most certainly be doing uncut readings. There will most certainly be mispronunciations, yawns, stutters, repeats, other various mistakes that can happen when you do a live reading without any editing. The poems might be different. A lot of them are very short, so I may be able to redo a couple of those and edit them in more detail. But we'll just see how it goes. I'm doing this for the entire month of October, up to whenever I finish reading this book. There's a lot more than 31 stories and poems that Edgar Allan Poe wrote for us. So, regardless, without further ado, here is Edgar Allan Poe, a biographical note. The life of Edgar Allan Poe was, like so many of his tales, short, poignant, and strangely haunted. Afflicted by a nervous disorder which manifested itself in alcoholism, Poe died at the early age of 40. Yet he left behind him a literary legacy, particularly in the field of the short story, unrivaled to this day. Poe was born in Boston on January 19, 1809, the son of itinerant actors Betty and David Poe, and after an early childhood spent in a succession of shabby dressing rooms, was orphaned at the age of 3. Taken in by John and Frances Allen of Richmond, the child grew up under the care of Mrs. Allen and her elderly servant, Nancy. In 1815, John Allen took his family to England and Scotland, and in 1816, the first one was 1815. In 1816, Edgar was enrolled in a London boarding school, but Mrs. Allen was contracting tuberculosis, and John Allen's business ventures were going badly, so the family returned to Richmond in 1820, moving into a cottage facing Clay Street. Edgar's education continued, first at Joseph W. Clark School and then at an academy run by William Burke. A fine athlete, he set a broad jump record of 21 feet 6 inches, and possessed of a brilliant mind, the young man seemed to have an assured future. Yet he was already something of a brooder. He enjoyed long walks with his poetically inclined older brother, William Henry, and scrawled numerous love poems delivered by his sister Rosalie to the girls of Miss Mackenzie's seminary. His relations with his foster father were never good, and were not improved by the boy's unsuccessful stint as a clerk in John Allen's store. In 1826, he won grudging consent to enter the University of Virginia, but received a minimum financial help. The difficulties of his financial situation at college led him to drink, and eventually to gamble. He left the university at the end of 1 year, $2,000 in debt, though among the top students in scholastic standing. Returning to Richmond, he suffered a harsh disappointment. He had fallen in love with a Richmond girl named Elmira Royster, and had written her letters from college. But Elmira's parents had intercepted the letters, and Elmira, assuming he had forgotten her, had become engaged to another man. Out of his heartbreak, he wrote a long poem, Tamerlane, destined to become his first published work. Friction with his foster father came to a head soon after, and following an angry argument, Poe was forced to leave home. He headed for Boston, the city of his birth, and New England's budding literary center. For 6 weeks, he tried unsuccessfully to obtain work, and on May 26, 1827, enlisted in the U.S. Army under the name of Edgar A. Perry. Poe described himself as 22 years of age, a native of Boston, 5 feet 8 inches in height, with gray eyes, brown hair, and a fair complexion, and listed his occupation as a clerk. Assigned first to Fort Independence in Boston Harbor for training, he was presently transferred to the quartermaster's office. Meantime, in midsummer of 1827, through the offices of a Boston acquaintance, he got his first book printed. Little more than a pamphlet, wrapped in a buff cover and containing some 40 pages, it bore the title Tamerlane and Other Poems. The author's name appeared nowhere. The title page simply indicated that the work was by a Bostonian. On November 8, 1827, Poe's company boarded the Waltham in Boston Harbor, and 10 days later docked at Fort Moultrie off Charleston, South Carolina. While stationed there, he started work on his first symbolic poem, longer than Tamerlane and bolder in concept, calling it Al-Araf. Despite a promotion to regimental sergeant major, Poe decided the army was not for him, and confessing his true name and identity, asked for a discharge. It was granted on condition that he achieve a reconciliation with his foster father. When John Allen refused, Poe suffered a nervous collapse and was taken to the post hospital with a fever. Then on February 28, 1829, Francis Allen died, and John Allen, acceding to his wife's last request, agreed to see his foster son again. The discharge from the army was arranged, and the two men made a truce. It did not last long, however, and in May, Poe left his father's home to stay with his widowed aunt, Mrs. Maria Clem, and her younger daughter, Virginia. Meantime, Al-Araf was published by a Baltimore firm and received considerable critical notice. In the summer of 1830, the young poet turned back once more to the idea of a military career. Taking entrance examinations for West Point, he gained admission and immediately regretted it. He fell into the same drinking and gambling habits that he had surrendered to at the University of Virginia. Once more, John Allen, now remarried, refused to pay his foster son's bills. Early in 1831, Poe was court-martialed and discharged. He left the Point for nearby New York, where he succeeded in arranging for publication of a book of his poems, after which he again took trunk and carpet-bag to his aunt, Mrs. Clem, in Baltimore. The death of his brother, William Henry, had the effect of strengthening his dependence on Mrs. Clem. A love affair with a Baltimore belle named Mary Starr ended in a scandal caused by Poe's drinking. Shortly afterward, John Allen cut his foster son out of his will, and Mrs. Clem, her daughter Virginia, and their wayward poet cousin found themselves in serious straits. But in 1833, a sudden new gleam of hope shone. On October 12th of that year, the Baltimore Weekly Saturday Visitor published a short story that had won the periodical's $50 prize, M.S., Found in a Bottle, by Edgar A. Poe. More important than the money was the critical acclaim for the 24-year-old author. Very soon, Poe was earning money by writing. The Southern Literary Messenger published Bernice, Shadow, and other stories. By the very time that his career was beginning to flourish, Poe started experimenting with opium, under the influence of English poets Elizabeth Barrett and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Nevertheless, Thomas Willis White, publisher of the Southern Literary Messenger, invited Poe to join his staff, and the young poet, now a short story writer, left Baltimore for Richmond. By this time, he was deeply in love with Virginia Clem, 14 years old, beautiful, and a worshipper of her brilliant cousin. His first few weeks in Richmond were spent in alternate states of excitement and depression, and in September he came to a decision, returned to Baltimore, and took out a marriage license. Poe and Virginia Clem were married on May 16, 1836, and spent a 2-week honeymoon in Petersburg. Once more, it seemed as if a secure and happy future lay ahead. But once more, stability was short-lived. Poe took to staying out all night, scandalizing Richmond with his neglect of his young wife and flagrant attention to other women. At the same time, his habits affected his work, and by the end of 1836, Mr. White was disillusioned with his new editor. On January 3, 1837, Poe took leave of his readership and moved with Mrs. Clem and Virginia to New York, where he felt sure his contacts would be able to provide him with a means of earning a living. However, New York was in the depth of a depression, and once again Mrs. Clem became the sole support of the family, eking a scant living for the three from a boarding house. In June 1837, Harper's accepted Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which it published the following year, while the American Monthly accepted Poe's Von Yon, the Mystific. However, the Poes still had little money, and in August 1838, Poe decided to try his luck in Philadelphia. The family settled into a small house on Coleridge Street, near Fairmount Park, and existence became as normal as it ever was to be. After trying for months to find regular employment in one of the periodicals, Poe began to turn to whatever kind of writing was offered. In April 1839, he took out a copyright on a textbook about shells, the conchologist's first book, which, like his other hack work, netted him very little financial gain. To add to his problems, Virginia's health was now beginning to fail. In July 1839, Poe wrote to William E. Burton asking for employment on the Gentleman's Magazine, issuing from Philadelphia, and received a job offering $10 a week for 2 hours editorial work per day. He accepted. Besides numerous book reviews, he contributed stories, including The Fall of the House of Usher. Late in December of that year, Poe realized one of his dearest ambitions, the publication of 25 of his stories in 2 handsome volumes entitled Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, published by the firm of Leah and Blanchard. Poe then began to think of a magazine of his own, an idea which rapidly hardened into a resolve. In January 1841, he launched the Pin magazine. It was a financial failure, and Poe was forced to accept an editorial position with George Rex Graham, who had recently bought the Gentleman's Magazine. In the issue of April 1841, he published the world's first detective story, and one of the greatest, Murders in the Rue Morgue. Under Poe's editorship, the Gentleman's Magazine experienced a promising rise in circulation, and for the moment Poe was free of financial strain with an annual salary of $800 a year, in that era a respectable income, plus fees for his stories and poems. But one evening, toward the middle of January 1842, Virginia was stricken with a tubercular attack. Poe again was filled with despair and began to drink heavily. His relations with co-workers became strained and finally impossible, and Poe was dismissed from the staff in May of 1842, although he still continued to publish in Gentleman's. Recovering from this breakdown, Poe exerted himself once again to gain subscriptions for his own Pin magazine, now to be called The Stylus. But he was sick and delirious much of the time, and the doctor was called as often to attend him as Virginia. For 7 weeks he remained bedridden. In early 1843, The Telltale Heart, Lenore, and important critical work, The Rationale of Verse, appeared in a new and short-lived magazine, The Pioneer, for which Poe was paid $10 a story. At the same time, The Gold Bug ran in another periodical and was widely reprinted. Momentarily, his enthusiasm for the Stylus returned, but once again he fell into his drinking habit, and even though he continued to write in fitfully brilliant fashion, The Raven was finished in early 1844. The onset of disintegration was apparent. On April 6, 1844, Poe decided to try his luck again in New York. Leaving Mrs. Clem to dispose of what little they had left behind, he boarded a train with Virginia. They rented an apartment on 130 Greenwich Street, and following a visit to the New York Sun, Poe's remarkable balloon hoax was perpetrated. The publicity and profit got Poe some freelance work, enabling him to bring Mrs. Clem to New York. Once again, things appeared to be well. Momentarily, Virginia's health bloomed. Poe stopped drinking and wrote steadily. On January 29, 1845, The Raven appeared in a New York Mirror, where Poe had been working for 3 months. Overnight, Poe's reputation as a poet, as well as a story writer and a critic, was made. On February 22nd, he left the Mirror and joined the staff of the newly formed Broadway Journal. He received $1 a column for his writing and was able to move his family to a small apartment at 195 Broadway, nearer the newspaper office. In the summer, Poe had a volume called Tales published by Wiley and Putnam. The following November, the same firm brought out a companion volume. Excuse me. The firm brought out a companion volume, The Raven and Other Poems, a book containing 31 poems and selling at 31 cents a copy. Poe was now receiving royalties for the first time in his life, and by October 1845 had acquired ownership of the journal. But just as he seemed on the brink of success, Virginia's health began to fail again, and Poe turned again to drink. Also, just at this time, he made the acquaintance of Mrs. Frances S. Osgood, a new poet, and by the end of the summer, rumors spread of an affair between the two. The journal folded with the issue of January 3, 1846, but Poe was soon busy with a series of articles on New York personalities, the literati, for Godey's Lady's Book. In an effort to help Virginia recover her health, the family left Turtle Bay in midsummer of 1846 for a cottage in Fordham, a village about 13 miles north of the city, now East 192nd Street. Just at this time, Poe was being discovered in France. Charles Baudelaire, himself a young poet, read a translation of Poe's The Black Cat, published in a Paris newspaper. Fascinated with the writing, Baudelaire undertook translations of his own and placed Poe permanently among the best-known foreign writers in France. On the night of January 30th, 1847, the long, drawn-out tragedy of Virginia Poe came to an end. Virginia was 24 when she died. Poe broke down completely. Mrs. Shue, a widow who had nursed Virginia through the last months of her illness, stayed on to care for Poe. Gradually, he recovered enough to resume his freelance writing. Finally, on May 23, 1848, George P. Putnam, late of Riley and Putnam, decided to risk publication of 500 copies of Poe's Disquisition on the Theory of the Universe, Eureka, for which the author received an advance of $14. Although this volume was not widely popular, it ultimately found purchasers, and an additional printing of 250 copies was required. Ulalume, which has been called his most characteristic poem, also belongs to this period. At this time, Poe, then 39 years old, met and began courting Mrs. Helen Whitman, 45-year-old widow of a young lawyer from Massachusetts. The two wrote love poetry to one another, and on September 21st, 1848, Poe presented himself at her door in Providence to ask for her hand. On December 23rd, the marriage banns were published, but the marriage never took place. Mrs. Whitman was informed that Poe had also been courting Mrs. Annie Richmond, whom he had met in Richmond in the fall of that year, while in the city obtaining subscriptions for the stylus. Also, it seemed there had been another drinking spree, during which Mrs. Richmond had shown Poe the sympathy he thrived on. Mrs. Whitman broke off the engagement. Although plagued with severe headaches after his return from Providence, Poe set to work again. And again things went well for a time. On February 7, 1849, he finished Hop Frog, which was printed by the Boston Weekly, the flag of our Union. It paid him $5 a page, and Poe was soon contributing regularly. In April, Von Kemplin and his Discovery appeared, and 2 weeks later, the poem for Annie. On July 7th, Poe's tribute to Mrs. Clem, To My Mother, was published. But the pressures of work and the rumors still circulating about him and Annie sent Poe into another breakdown, through which Mrs. Clem again nursed him. In late April 1849, Poe received a letter from Mr. Edward H. N. Pater, son of Oquawka, Illinois, a complete stranger, offering to finance a magazine on which Poe would enjoy full editorial control. To get the magazine started, Mr. Patterson proposed a 3-month lecture tour by Poe. Poe undertook the tour, but it turned out disastrously, ending in another breakdown, accompanied by attempts at suicide. Recovering once more, he returned to Richmond, where he gave a brilliant lecture at the Exchange Hotel on August 17th on the poetic principle. In Richmond, he took the opportunity to visit Elmira Royster, now a rich widow. Poe's charm was as magnetic as ever. Soon afterward, their engagement was announced, but Elmira began to suspect that Poe was interested primarily in her money, and called off the engagement. Poe broke down again. Elmira, who sincerely loved him in spite of everything, finally consented to the marriage. The wedding was set for the following October, but for the last time his fatal inclination intervened. Poe's exact movements are unclear, but on the morning of September 28th, he got off a train in Baltimore drunk and in a high fever. He made his way to the house of a friend, Dr. Nathan C. Brooks. Not finding the doctor at home, Poe wandered off and was neither seen nor heard of for 5 days. On the 3rd of October, another doctor friend, J.E. Snodgrass, was summoned to Ryan's salon on Lombard Street. A stranger had found Poe semi-conscious, stretched on a broad plank across some barrels on the sidewalk. He was rushed to Washington College Hospital and placed in charge of their resident physician, Dr. J. J. Moran. A coma was succeeded by delirium and tremors. On the morning of the second day he became calmer, but lapsed into rantings, which continued through the following Saturday night. On Sunday morning, October 7th, 1849, he had another short rest from his agonies, but at 5 a.m., as the doctor looked on, he moved his head gently, spoke his last words, "Lord, help my poor soul," and died. He died alone. Elmira Royster had no idea where he was, and neither did Mrs. Clem. He was buried on October 9th in the Presbyterian Cemetery at Fayette and Green Streets, in a lot that had belonged to his grandfather, David Poe. In 1875, his coffin was removed to the southeast corner of the cemetery, where his monument now stands.